Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm very honored to be invited to present. Um, I'm Danielle Bitterman, and I'm going to talk about the role of AI in clinical trials. Here are my disclosures. And so my goal for the next 20 minutes is to give you a high-level overview of what AI is and what are the different ways that AI may support clinical trial design and conduct. Now, I won't be able to, it's impossible to go over all the different ways that AI will interface with clinical trials, but I hope to at least start to give a sense of where we are and where we may be going in this area. So I'll touch on areas of trial design, cohort accrual, patient engagement, and results reporting. And then kind of cross-cutting throughout, I will weave in some of the safety concerns and things to be on the lookout for and think about when you're considering integrating AI into your clinical trial approach to developing and carrying out clinical trials. But first, what is artificial intelligence? Because artificial intelligence is a very broad term and people use it in all different ways. The field of AI has been around since the 1950s, and it was coined back then as the science and engineering of making intelligent machines, which is also very vague. So more specifically, you can think of it as programming a computer to perform tasks that require quote unquote human-like intelligence. So these are things like decision-making, object detection, problem solving, and pattern recognition. Things that a calculator on your phone, historically couldn't carry out on its own. And I like to bucket AI into two different categories, narrow AI and general AI, because they're kind of talked about together, but um, you know, they're quite different. They're the same technology with with different implications. And right now, we really live in a world of narrow AI. General AI is more of where we may be going in the future. Narrow AI are AI algorithms that are designed for a single or a few tasks, like they can do clinical trial matching, they can predict an outcome, but they can't do both or do anything the way a human could. They perform within a limited domain, so they'll only perform within oncology or only perform within the legal domain, and they can't kind of handle everything that comes at them, and they process only one or a few data types. And common data types that clinical AI algorithms process are structured data from the electronic health records, text, imaging, either pathology images or radiology images, and waveform high-frequency data like blood pressure, EKG signals. General AI is AI that's kind of the futuristic AI designed to learn a general intelligence, and this really much more reflects how a human thinks. It's designed to, it handles many or any task, performs across many domains, and processes many domain types. So in the past couple of years, there's been a huge amount of hype about AI. And how do we get here? Why has there been so much excitement about this? And I think it's because with the advent of large language models, either the models underlying things like ChatGPT, we are starting to see hints of general purpose AI. So large language models came out of the field of natural language processing, and that's my area of research. So you'll hear me talk about examples largely drawn from natural language processing. So they've been around since the 2019s, but they've been trained on huge, ever more data, general text on the internet. And as these models have gotten bigger and bigger, up to thousands of times larger than their kind of or their predecessors from 5 years ago, they start to be able to have a general knowledge. They can kind of answer all different types of questions or tasks you throw at it. So that's generated a lot of excitement. All right. So now focusing on the AI domain, what are unmet trial needs that AI can help address? So you probably don't have to tell this audience, but 10% of new agents, at least in the United States, advance to FDA approval. So there's a huge amount of dropout. So there's a resource inefficiency there. We have high rates of trial closure due to failure to accrual. We have low diversity among trial participants, which makes it hard to generalize results and advance healthcare kind of equitably for everyone. Costs and other resources for conducting trials limits accessibility. And we have challenges with standardized and long-term endpoint reporting. And these are all areas that I think AI may be able to help support. So first, AI for clinical trial design. And there are different ways that AI might be able to support AI clinical trial design, but I wanted to highlight one early area that's potentially exciting, and that's the use of digital twins. Digital twins are um, uh, virtual representations of patients' data that are generated by a generative AI. So these are models that are trained on past patients to predict what happens in the future to what happened in the future to those patients. You can then apply those models to a current patient to create a digital twin. And then from that digital twin, you can predict what may occur in that patient. And you can use this with, they potentially could be used with all different types of data. So you could recreate what will happen in that patient's notes in the future. You could recreate what that patient's imaging might look like in the future. So potential here is for cohort selection, helping to develop synthetic study arms, N of 1 trials, and drug repurposing. So if you have a patient, you have its digital twin, you can have your N of 1 trial where you have what actually happens, what would happen on the standard of care, and then what actually happens on the trial. However, this is really, I view, much more of a future technology because right now we really don't have ways for robust and reliable twin generation that can handle multimodal data and that are not really biased because the models learn from the data you trained on, and we have biased healthcare systems, and any past patients are going to reflect older standards of care. So if you have a lot of data trained on much older patients, your model is going to replicate those biases and kind of older standards of care in your current patient. And that's not necessarily what we want. And we don't have ways to address that yet. And that's kind of starts to touch on the issue of one of the big challenges with AI enhanced prediction, which kind of digital twins falls in the bucket of. And that's first the challenge of algorithmic bias. As I said, algorithms learn the biases that from their pre-training data, and they learn biases based on inaccuracies or incorrect proxies that you use as your outcome to train your data for. This is one kind of this is a study that got a lot of publicity. There was a model that was widely implemented in the United States that was used to predict whether a patient was likely to have a lot of complex care needs, and those patients were then triaged into a complex care clinic. However, they didn't use a number of chronic conditions to develop the model, to train the model. They used the costs of care associated with that patient. And because in the United States, we spend less money on Black patients than we do on white patients because of systematic biases and racism in our society, the model took a mental shortcut and was more like use race as a big predictor of whether that patient would have complex care needs. So white patients were getting triaged with a lower number of chronic conditions, whereas Black patients needed a lot more chronic conditions before they were automatically triaged into the specialty clinic. Also, AI models have generalizability challenges, like many other different types of statistical systems. But because these models can be very, very computationally big, they have a lot of parameters, they can very easily overfit, even more than some of the smaller models do. And because of that, we've seen a lot of models fail to generalize outside of the population they were developed on. So this is another example here on the right of a model that was widely implemented in one of our major electronic health record systems to predict the risk of sepsis. And it performed well kind of in the population it was trained on. It was widely rolled out. And when it was rolled out in other sites, it did not generalize and it missed a lot of patients who did have sepsis, and it just created a lot of alerts for the patients that the physicians were already detecting as having sepsis and started on antibiotics. So generalizability throughout is very critical to assess with AI models, and especially important and is an ongoing challenge. Okay. AI for clinical trial matching. And there's a lot of excitement about the potential for AI for clinical matching as a way to improve accrual and representation on our studies. So why is this such a challenge? So this is an example of just the eligibility criteria for one study on a pediatric brain tumor. And this is honestly kind of not a particularly long eligibility criteria list. So, but it's clear, and as you as trialists know, eligibility criteria are extremely complex and they're not easily converted into simple rules. And that makes it very difficult to automate matching of criteria to what's present in that patient's records. Clinical information about eligibility also, when present, is often in the clinical note text, which is not straightforward to mine. And so assessing eligibility requires reasoning, judgment, interaction. And so it really can't be captured by traditional algorithms. One way to address this is to always create your eligibility criteria. Use structured data and standard data elements for eligibility criteria, but there right now are not a kind of widely accepted set of standard data elements for eligibility criteria. And there's a lot of nuance in how we set up our eligibility criteria that can be very hard to represent purely in structured data. So that's why it has been so challenging thus far. There is a lot of excitement now to use large language models that may be able to do some of that reasoning and matching of patients when there's some ambiguity and really complex descriptions within the text. You might hear about retrieval augmentation being used for this. This is a kind of new paradigm where you combine the strength of a large language model and kind of putting a query into context and a reliable external database that you then use to match kind of with good rules. And the language model can put it all into context and hopefully spit out an eligible relevant output. So you can use something like this to take in patient data, match it to the closest clinical trial. It will spit out eligible trials. Likewise, you can go the other direction, kind of give a language model clinical trial eligibility criteria. You have a retrieval module that retrieves relevant patients and you spit out eligible patients. So there's excitement here. We're still not quite at an area where this is, ready for prime time. Okay, and this is where I start to get very excited about the potential for AI for clinical trials, and that's an AI for patient education and engagement. And why is this important? Patient and family engagement and education can improve understanding of what's involved in a clinical trial. And we know this is critical because a lot of patients, even after going through the full informed consent form, do not understand what they are consenting for. And I believe Suba will touch on this in a lot more detail. And this kind of creates challenges for recruitment, also retention and adherence, because patients don't know what they're signing up for. They don't know what's involved in the trial. For example, how many visits is a trial going to add? What are the costs associated? And patient education is fundamentally a health equity issue, because if patients who have lower health literacy tend to be from populations that are already marginalized and underrepresented, and this additional barrier to clinical trial involvement further kind of amplifies the health disparities crisis we have in kind of throughout the world. Now, AI could potentially facilitate the development and dissemination of educational and engagement materials to diverse communities, because developing these educational materials are important, but really, really time intensive and difficult to tailor to the wide variety of patients' needs. And this personalization is one kind of really appealing avenue for AI, because you're not requiring the AI you're not leaning on the AI for its internal knowledge, you're leaning on its kind of ability to change style. We did a study kind of starting to look at AI-enhanced patient education. This is not in a clinical trial setting, but it does kind of show some of the potential and risks here. So we looked at the ability of a large language model, GPT-4, to respond to patients' questions about their cancer symptoms. So we took 100 kind of descriptions of cancer patients paired with questions about their symptoms, and first asked oncologists to write responses to those questions manually, like they would when they're responding in our kind of electronic patient portal system, which is common in the United States. Then we had GPT-4 draft the response, and then the oncologists edited the responses until they thought it was kind of good enough to show to a patient. And this is not totally theoretical. Many of our healthcare systems are rolling out large language models to respond to patient questions. In our study, GPT-4 drafts were acceptable without edits in 58% of cases, which I found to be quite impressive, given that GPT-4 was not trained specifically to be a clinical expert. So in more than half the cases, it gave a decent response. And it was associated with low risk of harm in 82% of cases. However, the GPT-4 drafts were associated with a severe risk of harm or death in 8% of cases. So a minority, but a clinically significant minority of cases. So here's an example of one of the questions that we gave to the oncologist and the model. This was a patient with prostate cancer who's on ADT, so he was on a hormone therapy, asking, I've been experiencing hot flashes and night sweats for the past week. Is this a side effect of my treatment, or should I be concerned about something else? This was the physician-written message. It's short, to the point. It's not wrong, but it's concise. It doesn't include a lot of additional education. Here's the AI-assisted message. So this is a message that was drafted by GPT-4, the language model, and then edited by the oncologist. And you can see it's much longer, but I've highlighted areas where it includes a lot of new educational content that a busy physician really would never have time to write. So it goes into the mechanism of action of ADT and why it causes hot flashes and night sweats. And it also gives some recommendations for how to manage at home. Now, I think an outstanding question is whether patients like having AI involved in this way. Do they like this style? You know, some patients might like this kind of really kind of very formal and long response. Some patients might find this off-putting. So there's a lot more research to go in here, but I think this kind of gives a glimpse into where we can support clinicians in improving education of patients. However, we did show evidence of something called anchoring bias and automation bias. So our physicians changed the content. The content of the responses were significantly different when they used the language model assistance, which is when they edited the draft, versus when they wrote it manually. We categorize the content of the responses, and you can just, this is just a high-level view of from the colors, the different types of content that was in all the responses. And you can see these were the manual responses. Here's that GPT-4 draft, language model draft, and here are the GPT-4 assisted responses. And you can see the content is significantly different between the manual and then the GPT-4, the drafts of the GPT-4, the responses that GPT-4 were involved in. And the language model assisted draft was very similar in content to what was originally output by GPT-4. So this raises kind of the issue that human-computer interaction, so the nuances about how humans work with AI in medicine could impact clinical decision-making in unexpected ways. So in a situation like this, is the large language model really just helping kind of physicians restyle and kind of give the information in a better way and improve efficiency, or was it really driving the clinical recommendations and the physician was taking on more of the language model recommendations, because that's a really different type of risk setting. And clinical, and you know, as you get into rarer populations, you can expect the models are going to provide less high quality information because that's going to be less well represented in the pre-training data set. So what are some future applications here? You know, language models can be used to improve health literacy by tailoring text simplification, multilingual translation, interactive interfaces, and then multimodal communication. So the ability to give information in ways other than just text, providing it in images, videos, voice, et cetera, different formats, depending on what each patient will learn best from. All right. And finally, and I'll go through this quickly to give time for Stuba, there's a lot of potential of AI for improved data collection and phase 4 monitoring, and we are probably getting closest to kind of prime time in this area. So a lot of the data that we collect on our patients is quote unquote unstructured. That means it's not something that's readily extractable in its kind of an understandable format for a computer to analyze. And then in clinical trials, we often want to get information out of this unstructured data, be it for side effect, adverse event extraction, reporting on the pathology and kind of reporting RECIST criteria for kind of monitoring a patient's response to treatment in the cancer setting. And this is a manual, labor-intensive, resource-intensive process, and not easy to standardize. And AI could be able to help here. So here's one example where we looked at the potential of language models to automatically extract social determinants of health from the clinic notes, some patients' clinic notes, because this is something that in the United States is usually documented in the clinic notes. And so we don't have a lot of good ways to measure and monitor social determinants of health at scale. So our models extracted different types of social determinants of health. So the goal was to create a model that can search through a patient's records, find notes that discuss social determinants of health, then have the model automatically structure that data so you can end up with a nice table populated with that patient's social determinants of health. And this type of thing you could see being replicated for all different types of outcomes and characteristics. And so our models performed quite well. The larger the model was, the better it performed. We did see that our models had a generalizability issue as well, like I discussed earlier on in the talk. When we looked at, the models were trained on oncology patients. When we looked at applying these models to ICU patients, the performance dropped significantly. So that's another risk to look out for when considering using a new model. However, our models did identify 94% of patients with adverse social determinants of health, compared to only 2% of patients when structured data alone were relied upon. And then and I'm going to speed up here. We did see evidence of algorithmic bias with the language models as well. When we change race and gender descriptors in our sentences, the models had a high frequency of changing their social determinant of health classification based, again, only on those descriptors that should not address our classes of social determinant, should not impact how a model determined our class of social determinant of health. And the ChatGPT, the largest language model that was not specifically fine-tuned for this setting, actually changed this determination in 20% of cases. So that's a fairly high rate, and then again, underlines how important assessing algorithmic bias is before using these models. Kind of moving forward as we kind of start to integrate AI into our digital technologies, there's potential for also using language models in a chatbot type interface to automatically collect patient-reported outcomes as well. And so here are some, just finishing on some barriers to effective AI integration. We right now do not have adequate methods for robust preclinical validation and post-implementation at scale. And this is the biggest barrier to clinical translation, in my view. There remain challenges with data and model sharing and siloed data collection. And collaboration between data scientists, clinicians, and patients is really going to be essential to moving this field forward. And finally, we have data and technology inequities. I already talked about the issues of algorithmic bias. Due to models not being developed on data that are representative, but also underserved communities have less access to AI advances in technology in general. And so as we kind of roll out AI into clinical trials and into medical care more broadly, we need to make sure that the communities who could benefit from it most actually are able to have access to these advances. And I'll end there. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Danielle. I think Suba's going to join us now and go ahead and get started. And then we'll be able to do all the questions, I think, at the end, because I'm guessing there'll probably be a couple of overlaps there. Thank you.
Good morning, or I guess I should say good afternoon, everyone, since I'm coming in from Houston, Texas. All right, let me share my screen. So my name is Suba Purney. Let me just make sure here. So my name is Subha Purney, and I am an assistant professor at MD Anderson Cancer Center. And so I'm going to focus really on the ethical considerations for use of AI in clinical trials. So no disclosures. So, research ethics, just to provide some framework, really has its foundation as a field kind of in late 20th century revelations about the shocking human experimentation that went on in Nazi Germany. And this picture on the right is a picture I took some years ago at Auschwitz, where there's some doctor's coats hanging on a rack. And there were several abuses with medical experimentation that really took place there. And this kind of sparked this movement and codification of the rights of human participants in research, and led initially to the Nuremberg Code of 1947, where it was discussed that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And it also described, as I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, what kind of things are important when we think about this principle of informed consent. So what are the features that matter? And those include that the patient has capacity to understand what's going on, that they give affirmative consent. So the Nuremberg Code emphasizes that it's kind of an opt-in rather than an opt-out consent, as well as that there's no coercion and that there's full knowledge and comprehension of the purpose, risks, and benefits. And this code really highlights that it's not an institutional or, national obligation. It's really that each individual researcher has a moral obligation to ensure that ethical standards are met. So, despite this, in the US and other places, I'm sure that many of us are aware that there continue to be kind of abuses in terms of biomedical experimentation on human subjects. Throughout the 1970s in the US, the most famous example is the Tuskegee experiment. And this kind of sparked the Belmont Report, which described respect for persons, beneficence, and justice as really these like foundational principles. And for informed consent specifically, the Belmont Report discusses how important it is to have a reasonable volunteer standard. So that persons, knowing that the procedure is not necessary for their care, or even fully understood by the people administering their care, can decide voluntarily whether to participate. And further, that they should really understand the range of risk and that the participation is voluntary. So this kind of is the foundation for modern ethical requirements, but this paper by Ezekiel et al., published in JAMA in 2000, really describes how informed consent is necessary, but not sufficient for ethical research. And so they describe these specific ethical requirements in addition to informed consent, that the study has to have social or scientific value, be valid, there should be fair subject selection. So this is kind of specifically aimed at addressing issues with exploitation of vulnerable populations, as well as have a favorable risk-benefit ratio. Just because someone consents to something doesn't necessarily mean that it is an ethical experiment to do, as well as sets forward this concept of independent review, of course, informed consent and respect for subjects. So these ethical requirements are kind of the basis for current institutional review boards or institutional ethics committees reviewing clinical trial and other clinical research protocols. So what about when it comes to AI in clinical trials? And I would say, honestly, we're still doing clinical research. We're still doing clinical studies and intervention-based studies. And so mostly variations on the same principles really apply. What I'm going to focus on here is maybe a little bit more of the informed consent and what are like the unique potential harms or unique potential risks of the use of AI in clinical trials. Although, even though I'm focusing on informed consent, I think it really bears on all of these quite a bit. So again, informed consent, most fundamental ethical requirement for clinical trials, involving the disclosure of those specific risks and benefits. And really also, I would highlight contingent on the healthcare context, and that those specific duties embedded within that patient-clinician relationship. And I highlight that because that's a very specific relationship it's very different from the relationship between an institution and the specific patients. It's really, really different from the obligations that technology companies, like a technology startup that has an AI model that they're shopping around, has with patients or human subjects of research. So I think the healthcare context is really important to remember here. So within prospective intervention-based trials, patients are typically identified as candidates and screened for eligibility. And then the clinician and research staff discuss the clinical trial with patients and provide them with this kind of comprehensive informed consent form. There was a study showing that the mean number of pages for these forms is something like 21 pages. So they're quite lengthy. It's quite a lengthy discussion and addresses every feature of the trial. The patient signs a consent form and the clinician goes on to document. But it's important to remember that, informed consent is definitely a continuum. I mean, even now, while prospective clinical trials typically require a written informed consent via that process, there are waivers. And we can see that even when we think about clinical situations, like on the left here, this is actually just Tylenol, acetaminophen, and on the right here is chemotherapy. And so if a patient is admitted to the hospital, they do sign some kind of general consent. And so if they're administered Tylenol, if they have a headache one day, they're in the hospital, they're administered Tylenol, this is not something that requires like a specific informed consent tailored to that specific issue where you go through all the benefits and potential risks and alternatives to Tylenol. They may just be given Tylenol. Versus every time that we give chemotherapy, because of the differential risk-benefit analysis that's involved, we will go through a formal consent process, kind of discussing what are the specific side effects, what are the specific benefits for chemotherapy. And so those are clinical, but it kind of also applies to clinical research and clinical studies where there is definitely this continuum of risk. And it also applies to the use of AI in trials. I mean, on the left here, this is a well-known risk calculator for cardiovascular risk, cardiovascular events. And so this is kind of just a calculator using predefined parameters like race, sex, age, et cetera. And then based on these, it has this risk output of 13.5% risk of cardiovascular events. So there's again this kind of continuum. I mean, so modern use of AI as clinical decision support may not be so different from that, at least in terms of thinking about the inputs and outputs. But the difference is that we have this kind of algorithm giving us perhaps a risk output, and it could be the same risk output of 13.5%. But how do we really draw the line, and how do we think about these things differently? So are there novel or compounded risks to the use of AI in clinical research and trials? And I think that there are some that we should definitely discuss, specifically thinking about privacy, interpretability, human-machine interactions, this concept of performance drift, as well as bias, which I know Dr. Bitterman also touched upon a bit. So when it comes to privacy, AI algorithms, I mean, privacy concerns exist already, right? Both in healthcare contexts and very much outside of healthcare contexts. But perhaps the use of AI can actually compound this risk because it requires access to and transfer of far larger quantities of data. And the way this data is used over time may change. And so these two features may lead to escalation of privacy concerns. And it's just important to remember that privacy issues can really significantly affect patient trust in medical institutions. Public-private partnerships with tech corporations can also result in really poor protection of privacy. And there are existing examples with large companies in which that has been the case. Other privacy risks include the possibility of re-identification. So the ability to re-identify patients, even when data is shared without the classic protected health information. And so this is an example here. So I'm a radiation oncologist and I focus on brain tumors. And so you would think that MRI scans that are used in studies would not be identifiable. Say they're de-identified, they're not associated with any labels like name or birth date or other classic protected health information. But there are algorithms already that can actually reconstruct people's faces from these MRI scans, and they're getting better each day. And it's not just situations like this, it's kind of, re-identification from all sorts of data. Like it could even be genomic data potentially, as well as just kind of electronic medical record information where specific PHI labels are taken off, but the patient is still able to be kind of retroactively identified. The next risk that I would mention is transparency/interpretability. So, I mean, this comes up a lot when discussing AI. For some models, it may not be clear even to the developer how it actually works. I mean, a large amount of data is being interpreted in an unsupervised manner in many cases by AI models. And the typical user, which I would say is most likely a clinician or a researcher within this context, would not be able to understand how it works, and thus the rationale for the outputs. This may be less of an issue with some of the examples that Dr. Bitterman had of utilization of large language models in cases where the text is kind of written in patient messages, because it's kind of a little bit of a different situation. But there's other situations in which you're using AI as a decision support tool, and you're not really clear where that 13.5%, for example, came from. And so when a clinician doesn't really understand how a model works or the rationale for the outputs, that also means that they may be unable to detect errors or hallucinations. You may remember that when there was the early press coverage of ChatGPT, there was also all this coverage about hallucinations that the large language model made, including I'm sure if I had asked it to put together this talk for me, like the citations may be hallucinated, and that comes up a lot. Also unable to detect bias or even cyber hacking. And there are post hoc efforts that can be made to understand how the black box led to the output, but such efforts may not be completely reliable. And I think this is important. I'm a clinician and clinical trialist, and I find this to be really essential for clinical context. Just realizing that being able to explain how decisions are made to patients tends to be really pivotal for trust. For example, when I make decisions about whether to offer radiation for brain tumors, I tend to explain those in a lot of detail and the reasons why and the data they're based on. And so I'm just highlighting that we do have to kind of think about implications for patient trust. The next thing I would mention is human-machine interaction. So this is Roald Amundsen. He's actually a polar explorer. And back then, the tech innovations of the time were, the newest sled, or I guess the furs that he was covered in. But regardless of what the innovations were, he wrote the human factor is 3/4 of any expedition. And I think that's really true. I mean, we have to really think about what the human and machine interactions are. It's so important to understand the human factors portions of this integration into clinical and research use. So at this point, most medical AI works to help clinicians in some way, right? Aiding efficiency, answering portal messages for you, helping with risk prediction. And there are human factor issues from interaction with algorithms. We think about things like over-reliance, right? Maybe you don't correct the AI in the situations that it's wrong, you rely on it too much. And then ultimately over time, that actually leads to de-skilling. So you're no longer able to really detect errors. That may not even be obvious to the user. That may be a much more subtle thing. But we're really in the early stages, and more autonomous AI is really a possibility. And it just leads to questions about how the responsibilities are divided. Is the AI being supervised, et cetera? The next risk that I would mention is performance drift. So model performance may really change over time. Performance drift occurs when data, environments, or clinical paradigms change. And so for continually learning models, this is really part of the design. These shifts can alter risk-benefit ratios and worsen performance of models, but users, for kind of some of the reasons mentioned, may not really be able to identify such errors from changing performance. The next risk that I would mention is bias. So already touched upon a little bit, but really an AI system, an AI model is really just as good as the data used to train it. And training data sets may not equally or accurately reflect groups, resulting in pretty poor performance when applied to populations in practice. And each situation, each community, each hospital is different. AI algorithms may also be using factors that are inherently biased to make decisions. And this can also obviously be relevant for fair subject selection if AI tools are used to identify the subjects for clinical trials. Here are a couple of examples that I would mention. So of kind of unintentional perpetuation of racial bias. So this is a science study from 2019 in which a widely used commercial algorithm that aimed at identifying patients for high-risk care management programs recommended white versus Black patients at much higher rates for these programs because healthcare cost was used as a proxy for need. But really, there was systemic discrimination that meant that less money was spent on Black patients with the same need levels. In a study that we've done looking at cancer clinical research using AI, out of 118 studies identified, only 5% report race for training and validation data sets. So it's hard to kind of even know based on published studies how generalizable those models are. In the studies that did report, 88% of participants, so patients whose data was used in either training or validation of these models, were white. So there's real concerns about how we can apply AI models that are trained on specific populations to different healthcare contexts. And it's not just racial bias that's an issue. I mean, there's all sorts of bias that can happen, gender bias, age-related bias, all sorts of things. It really just depends on how well we can apply it to a specific clinical context. So where does this leave us with AI models more generally? And I think there are all these risks, but there's definitely this continuum that I'd mentioned between, Tylenol and chemotherapy, where there are some models that may not actually pose as large of a risk in terms of the parameters that I've discussed, versus those that are more like chemotherapy, that are higher risk. And in fact, most patients at this time really have no idea that AI is used in their care. So should we really consent everyone for every low-risk use of AI? Should we go through that 20-page informed consent form? I think that every low-risk use of AI, every time we use a decision support tool, is probably too onerous of a burden to really go through. So maybe there's ways to satisfy obligations in the medical context without obtaining written informed consent. So I think this is more no longer just something that is an individual researcher's moral obligation, but kind of institutional and more systemic obligations to really carefully regulate development, clinical validation, quality systems, do human factors research, and then surveil the function of AI models in use over time. And this is kind of what the US Food and Drug Administration describes as well in terms of what we need for AI and machine learning as a medical device. Really good machine learning practices with clear expectations of quality systems, pre-marketing review, monitoring and risk management, increased transparency, and really post-market performance reporting, so that we're creating this whole system in which a whole culture and quality, as they say, of organizational excellence, in which models are safely created, reviewed, monitored, and continue to be monitored. So I think that many uses of clinical AI likely fall into this minimal risk category. So in the US, there's been revisions to multiple different regulations. And so that allows for more minimal risk clinical studies to be carried out. And in these minimal risk studies, these are the requirements. So obviously that they require no more than minimal risk, but also that waiver of informed consent doesn't affect the rights and welfare of the subjects. It couldn't be carried out without waiver or alteration. And whenever appropriate, subjects will be provided with additional pertinent information after participation. So for all trials using AI, should we allow for these consent waivers? Because most will not be feasible without these waivers because of the amount of data that we're talking about. And currently many are done as quality improvement, and consent waivers are already used. But again, with this continuum of risk, there are some that can be minimal risk depending on the situation, with quality systems in place and good practices in place. Whereas there's some that are higher risk that likely necessitate prospective informed consent. And that might be things like autonomous models or AI algorithms with really significant clinical decision implications. So right now, patients pretty much, for the most part, I think, assume that only humans and not AI systems are really making their healthcare decisions. And so I would argue for disclosure as a minimum standard, where disclosure allows patients to really determine how and by whom their healthcare decisions are made and allow for trust. By disclosure, I don't necessarily mean going through that 20-page informed consent form, but using these kind of broad disclosures with umbrella consent, but also with a requirement where we provide more detailed information about specific AI algorithms used in their care or in trials they're involved in. So that information is available if patients want it, but we are telling them also as part of a broad disclosure or umbrella consent that AI is being used in this clinical in these clinical decisions or clinical research studies. So I think for the most part, many modern ethical requirements for clinical research and clinical trials apply in the same way to clinical studies involving AI. But at this early point, novel risks of AI can include privacy concerns, this lack of interpretability, human-machine interaction issues, performance drift, and bias. But what we need is robust regulation and quality practices to create systems in which informed consent is not necessary for low-risk clinical uses. I think consent waivers are also reasonable in these systems for minimal risk research. But in order to appropriately respect patient autonomy, I do feel like, because the assumption right now is that that AI is not being used as decision support, that umbrella consents and additional disclosures are really needed to appropriately respect patient autonomy. All right, thank you so much.